Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzoro, and today we're going to start talking about how plants evolved from nothing, basically, from just the life that existed millions and millions and millions of years before there were even animals on Earth. And we're going to start talking about this by first talking about plants in general. All the different types of plants can be divided into four basic groups. We're going to identify those four basic groups, and we're going to start talking about what separates each group from all the others. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about how these groups generally came about, which group came first, and then which group evolved after that. And last, we're going to touch on the idea of, as plants were evolving, what was happening to plants? How were they changing in general? Not just between each group, but just as plants in general, what was happening as they went. Of the four main groups of plants, the first and the most basic are mosses. Mosses, scientific name, are bryophytes. There's actually three different types of bryophytes or mosses. There's real moss or traditional moss or true moss, which you see in this picture. And there's also two other groups, what are known as liverworts and hornworts. You may have seen these growing on the forest ground. They kind of look like moss. They're really short, but they are different categories than true moss, which you see in this picture. What makes mosses their own group of plants is that mosses are the only group of plants that don't have vascular tissue and produce spores. And what you'll notice as we go on is that these questions actually will separate out all the different categories from each other. I mean, moss is a plant, it's multicellular, it's eukaryotic, it reproduces sexually, and it alternates generations. But these particular plants don't have any vascular tissue, they don't have xylem and phloem, and they produce spores, not seeds. The next group of plants to evolve was ferns. Ferns are a group of plants known as seedless vascular plants, or they're otherwise known as fern and fern allies. Basically, everything that's a seedless vascular plant can otherwise be called a fern and fern ally. Ferns have vascular tissue, and this is what separates them from mosses. Unlike mosses, which lack xylem and phloem, ferns have xylem and phloem. This is important because, as you'll notice, mosses are very, very small, whereas ferns can grow pretty big. I mean, tree ferns are the tallest growing ferns, and they can grow 30 or 40 feet tall. Mosses really can't grow more than maybe an inch off the ground. And the reason for that is because of vascular tissue. Because ferns have a way of getting water from their roots to their leaves, and transporting sugar and nutrients throughout their body. Because they have vascular tissue, it allows them to be a lot taller than moss, which doesn't have vascular tissue. The only way mosses can absorb and move water is literally by sucking it up like a sponge. Like mosses, though, ferns don't produce seeds. They instead produce spores. The big difference between a seed and a spore is really what they are. Seeds have a protective coat, and they have a food supply. A spore is basically just a single cell. Because seeds have protection and food supplies, they can actually survive long times, thousands of years in some cases, without sprouting or germinating. They can wait till the conditions are just right to actually sprout. Spores can't. Spores take a lot less energy to make because they don't have any seed, they don't have any protective coats, and they don't have any food supplies. But even though they take less energy to make, they're much more vulnerable because they don't have protection, they don't have food. Wherever spore lands, it has basically 15 seconds to decide whether or not it wants to sprout or not, and then it could just die. Mosses lack vascular tissue, and they produce spores. Ferns have vascular tissue, and they produce spores. The next group of plants are called cone plants. The fancy scientific name for cone plants are gymnosperms. So far we have bryophytes, mosses, seedless vascular plants, ferns and fern allies, and now we have gymnosperms. If you take apart that word gymnosperms, the prefix gym actually means naked, and sperm means seeds. So these are plants that have vascular tissue, and they produce seeds. But those seeds are gym, they're naked. Instead of being contained in fruit, Gymnosperms produce exposed seeds in cones. They're not inside anything. They're actually exposed to the elements. Gymnosperms have vascular tissue, like ferns, but unlike ferns, they produce seeds, these bigger reproductive structures that have a food supply and have protection, instead of spores, which don't have that. And these seeds are produced inside the cones of gymnosperms. Gymnosperms most commonly are evergreens. That's the ones that you're typically used to looking at. But there are other gymnosperms, other cone-bearing plants. Things like sajo palms, for instance, are a cone-bearing plant. And I'll show you some of those as we go on. Last but not least, we have flowering plants. Flowering plants' scientific names are angiosperms. Angio means closed or covered sperms, seeds. What are those seeds closed or covered in? They're covered in a fruit, unlike gymnosperms, which have exposed seeds and cones. Flowering plants have vascular tissue, and they produce seeds, which, again, that looks a lot like gymnosperms before I tell you that those seeds are made in fruits or flowers. Those seeds aren't in cones anymore. So, 4 basic types of plants: bryophytes, mosses. They lack vascular tissue. They produce spores. The next group of plants is ferns and fern allies, seedless vascular plants. They have vascular tissue, but they produce spores, not seeds. Next is gymnosperms, conifers, cone plants, evergreens. These plants produce vascular tissues like ferns and fern allies, but unlike ferns and fern allies, they have seeds, not spores. The last group of plants, main group of plants, the last of the 4 is angiosperms, which, like gymnosperms, have vascular tissue and make seeds, but unlike gymnosperms, they produce their seeds in flowers and fruits. They don't produce their seeds in cones. Their seeds are covered. So, if you're following along, here's your basic timeline of plant evolution. As you move up this diagram, you're coming along in time. The first organisms that eventually would become plants is actually algae. All plants can be traced back to ancient green algae that was there way before the dinosaurs even got there. That algae would become the first and most primitive type of plants, moss. Now, mosses will eventually become ferns and fern allies, but mosses have to evolve something to become fern or fern allies. So what did they evolve? They evolved vascular tissue, xylem and phloem, and that's what separated mosses from the next group of plants to evolve in time, ferns. Just like mosses had to evolve vascular tissue to become ferns, ferns have to evolve something to become the next group of plants, cone plants, and that thing is seeds. Both mosses and ferns produce spores, tiny little unicellular, non-protected, no food supply cells that have the potential to become a moss plant or a fern plant. Seeds are multicellular packets of food and protection that, even though the plant produces less seeds, those seeds can last for a lot longer than spores and survive a lot of really harsh conditions. Once ferns started evolving seeds, they became the next group of plants, cone plants, gymnosperms. Those gymnosperms would eventually become flowering plants, angiosperms, once they evolved fruits and flowers. No gymnosperms, no cone plant has fruits or flowers. Only flowering plants do. That's why they're gymno. Their seeds are exposed to the elements instead of angio, enclosed in a fruit or flower. So this is your basic evolutionary timeline for plants. At the beginning of time, you start with algae, and then come the moss group, followed by the fern group, followed by cone plants, and then most recently flowering plants evolved. And with each step of evolution, the existing group had to evolve something new, be it vascular tissue to turn from moss to ferns, seeds to turn from ferns to cone plants, and flowers and fruits to turn from gymnosperms to angiosperms. Last but not least, I want to focus on this idea of what is happening to plants overall, all these different groups of plants overall as they're evolving. Yeah, they're getting bigger, they're getting vascular tissue, they're getting seeds, but actually, if you look at all these groups of plants, what you'll notice is something else is happening as well. If you look at the way they alternate generations, their phases change size as you move through time. As you move through time and one group of plants becomes another, their gametophyte, their sperm and egg producing phase, that phase actually gets smaller and shrinks. It starts off from green algae, which is basically one big gametophyte, to mosses, which, as I said before, is basically just testicles and ovaries, gametophytes growing out of the ground with those little sporophytes occasionally coming out, to ferns, which have a much larger sporophyte phase. That's the phase that you think of with ferns, and then a very small, kind of almost unnoticeable gametophyte phase, to seed plants, which their gametophyte phase is actually even microscopic. It's pollen. It floats through the air. It's only 1 or 2 cells. Versus the sporophyte phase, which is the entire tree or the entire plant. So as plants are evolving, their gametophyte phase is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, which means the sporophyte phase is becoming larger and larger and larger. All plants are still alternating on a yearly or decade-long schedule between sporophytes and gametophytes back and forth. That's what alternations of generations mean. But the actual sperm and egg producing phase gets smaller, and actually now is invisible to the naked eye in the latter groups of plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And the sporophyte phase is getting much and much larger. The seed and spore producing phase gets much, much larger. So that's it for the first lesson. We talked about what the 4 groups of plants are: bryophytes, mosses, ferns and fern allies, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms. And the differences is whether they produce vascular tissue, no in the case of mosses, but yes in the case of everything else, and whether they make seeds or spores, seeds for ferns and bryophytes, seeds for gymnosperms and angiosperms, spores for ferns and fern allies, as well as bryophytes, as well as what they make that seed in, whether they're making the seed, if you're a gymnosperm, in a cone, or whether you're making the seed if you're an angiosperm, in a fruit or a flower. And those groups of plants evolved in order, starting with algae, then going to mosses, which evolved vascular tissue to turn into ferns. Next, ferns evolved seeds to turn into gymnosperms. And finally, gymnosperms evolved flowers and fruits to turn into angiosperms. And they evolved in that order. And as they were evolving in that order, the gametophyte phase of the plant was getting smaller and smaller and smaller until angiosperms, where the gametophyte phase is pollen. It's infinitesimally small, microscopic. And the sporophyte phase of the plant, as a result, is getting larger and larger and larger. Okay, that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, what I'm going to take you through is I'm going to take you through the next 100 million years of plant evolution in about 2 minutes, and talk about how plants actually start out, what the world was that they were actually pollinating when they began.